The question is, this House has considered the Bercow Review of Services for Children and Young People, aged 0 to 19, with speech, language and communication needs. Mr John Bercow.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure for me this afternoon to follow the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Cardiff West, and I'm particularly grateful to him for his generous remarks this afternoon. I would like to take this opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker, also to acknowledge and pay tribute to the Secretary of State for Health and to the Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families, who have been unstinting in their support and encouragement of me in this venture over the last 10 months. A great many colleagues have engaged with the review, either by inviting me to visit a preschool, a primary school, a secondary school or a post-16 provision, or they have made a written submission, and to each and every one of them for their contribution to an important task, I am greatly indebted. Although it is invidious to single out an individual, I am moved, Mr Deputy Speaker, to pay a special tribute to someone who's gone the extra mile, way beyond the call of duty, in submitting material to me and offering me personal support and encouragement throughout. And that is the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Sheffield Brightside, whom I'm delighted to see in his place today. Reference was made by the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State to the process through which my colleagues on the Review Advisory Group and I have gone over the last 10 months. It is true that we have sought evidence from 4 different sources. We launched an online consultation questionnaire in October of last year, to which at the due date of January the 18th this year we had received in excess of 2,000 replies, of which just over a half were from parents, telling us what they thought, what worked, what didn't, and what was needed. In addition to that, we staged a series of focus or consultation groups around the country, calling upon children, young people and their parents to offer their impressions of the state of services. In addition to which, Mr Deputy Speaker, we thought it justified and prudent to stage 2 particular focus groups on the thorny questions of augmentative and alternative communication under the auspices of scope on the one hand, and of provision for young offenders courtesy of the Prison Reform Trust on the other. Thirdly, we went round the country, as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State said, visiting preschools, primary schools, secondary schools, post-16 facilities. A plethora of different examples were presented to us. We wanted to see London and the South East, but the Midlands and the North and the South West, urban and rural, mixed communities, different social cohorts, and the rest, in order to get the widest possible representative picture of what currently is, and as the case may be, I say to the House, is not on offer. Finally, we thought it right to secure the services of some noted and distinguished academic researchers in the field of speech, language and communication, a group of whom have engaged in a detailed project looking at service provision in 6 different areas and seeking to adduce evidence from their studies the better to inform future policy making and the prospects of necessary and beneficial research. I think it would be right to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that from what we have seen around the country, we have formed some fairly clear and explicit conclusions. Without doubt, there are some excellent professionals and high-quality services out there, but upon the whole, the present state of affairs in respect of speech, language and communication provision is highly unsatisfactory. Access to information and services is often poor. The quality of services themselves is very mixed. Continuity across the age range is lacking. Joint working between health and education professionals, which is so critical to the achievement of success, is rare, and the system is characterised by high variability and a lack of equity, the shorthand translation of which is that at present there is a postcode lottery across the country. Above all, I think it is right to say that the priority attached to communication is too low, and in our judgment, this must change. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for Bercow for giving way, and I congratulate him on this report, and I wrote to him about specific problems in my own constituency dealing with the recognition and treatment of dyslexia. But would he say a word about his findings about the more difficult autism and Asperger's syndrome, which seems to affect children increasingly nowadays?
I certainly will pick up on the theme that has been identified by my honourable friend, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it is essential that we should cater to all of the groups on the spectrum. And on that point, the need for a broad range, I will, if I may, say something more in a moment or two. The Parliamentary Under Secretary of State referred to the 5 themes around which the recommendations of the review have been formulated. Communication is crucial. Communication is the key life skill which enables children to learn, to achieve, to make friends and to interact with the world around them. Communication in that sense is a vital part of the equipment of citizenship. Yet all too often it has not enjoyed that priority in the minds of commissioners or of policymakers. There has been sometimes an unwritten, unspoken, dare I say it, lazy assumption that the children will speak when they're ready, and other important aspects of the children's development agenda have tended to elbow speech, language and communication out of the way. That is why we have recommended the creation of a Ministerial Communication Council, upon which both the Department of Health and the Department of Children, Schools and Families are prominently represented. We believe, too, that an identified individual with relevant expertise and commitment, a communication champion, should be appointed to drive forward the process of implementation, to report to the Communication Council, to raise awareness and to disseminate best practice. The Communication Champion will, over time, after appropriate and due preparation, have responsibility for overseeing and running the National Year of Speech, Language and Communication. And as part of that process of investing in speech, language and communication services a greater priority, it is right that information at key ages and stages of a child's development should be proactively made available in a readily accessible form to children, young people and, in particular, their parents, charting the normal course of communication development, indicating where a person should go if there is a difficulty, advising parents too on how best they can assist in the process of bolstering their own children's speech, language and communication development. So that concept that communication is crucial, accompanied and reinforced by a series of specific recommendations, is very important. The Minister rightly referred to early intervention. I would like, at the risk of being marginally pedantic, to describe it as early identification and intervention. And if we are to identify early, I believe that we need regular monitoring and surveillance of children's speech, language and communication development at key ages and stages. We haven't been overly prescriptive. There is scope for difference of opinion as to exactly the point at which it is most appropriate to undertake the monitoring. There is indeed also scope for local variation in what is judged to be right. But the principle that it should be done regularly, and that it should be done with a view to securing a signpost to appropriate assistance if there's a problem, is, I think, important and indeed inviolable. We all know that if you intervene early with a problem, a child has a better chance, other things being equal, of overcoming the difficulty, accessing the national curriculum and fulfilling his or her potential. The logical corollary of that is that if you don't intervene early, the problems mount. Emotional and psychological difficulties, behavioural problems, lower educational attainment, poorer employment prospects, persistent communication impairment, challenges to mental health, and even in extremis, Mr Deputy Speaker, a descent into offending and reoffending. And that is why it is so important that we do intervene early, both through that monitoring and surveillance, and by making speech, language and communication a prime component, a centrepiece of the work of all children's centres. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Firstly, could I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his enormous generosity towards me, but I want to congratulate him on an excellent piece of work, and on persuading the Government to have a year dedicated to bringing it alive and to get the recommendations implemented. Could I pick up the point he's just been making about early identification and the point that my honourable friend made from the front bench about point 3 of the 5-point plan? And that is to suggest to him that in this identification process, we need to take account of the fact that for many children, not all, but for many children, there will have been a problem of identifying speech, language and communication difficulties in their lives already before they actually reach a statutory group, or even before they're actually identified with Sure Start, and how important it is to work with the family and not just with the individual child on bringing alive their talent and their capability.
Put it more powerfully if he tried, Mr. Deputy Speaker. That early intervention is incredibly important. Yes, it involves the child, but it is important to ensure that we have the benefit of the services of multidisciplinary teams, the precise representative of which will be relevant in the particular case will vary from one situation to another. But you need to have speech and language therapists as part of the mix. You need to have teachers. You need to have classroom assistants. You need to have special educational needs coordinators. You might well, in certain circumstances, indeed need health visitors as well. And I think some flexibility in that process is important. Reference has already been made to the continuum of services. And I just want to underline that we need to ensure that through effective joint commissioning between education and health services, we commission services that are across the piece, universal services which can be of benefit to all children and young people who need to have the capacity to communicate taught, honed and nurtured, targeted services for those who require a little bit of additional help, sometimes only for a short period, sometimes for longer, and specialist services, often tailored for the benefit of those with acute and ongoing needs who will realistically require intensive and specialist provision, including therapy, sometimes for long periods into the future. And I simply say in all courtesy to the Government, I know that I have made recommendations in respect of augmentative and assistive communication, that is to say those who require communication aids, and of the requirements of young offenders, about which there is still some anxiety and scepticism. My message simply to the Government is, in taking this whole process forward and securing what I hope will be the advantageous implementation of the review report's recommendations, we must be sure not just to do the easy stuff. We mustn't cater only for those who have relatively minor difficulties, who need low-dosage intervention, and of whom there are large numbers. That is incredibly important, and ministers are right to highlight it. But we have a duty also to do more, to do all that is necessary, to do all that will bring benefit for those whose needs are the most acute. And frankly, if you are a child or a young person requiring an expensive piece of technological kit to have a voice, you are deeply needy. You might be non-verbal, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and in such a situation we must stop at nothing to ensure that the appropriate help is provided, and we mustn't in any sense fight shy of knowing the scale and incidence of the challenge with which we are confronted. And I think in taking forward those pathfinders we'll learn a great deal. 5 areas, and I'm grateful to the Government for this, funded by the Department of Children, Schools and Families, or the Department of Health, and they can fight about that between themselves, and with a responsibility to assess need, to devise services, to secure the appropriate skilled workforce, to put it into effect, to monitor the outcomes and to report the results. And that means having a workforce to boot. And that's why we've recommended that speech, language and communication must be at the heart of all the qualifications leading to the integrated qualifications framework. Qualified teacher status must demand a greater knowledge of and expertise to a degree in speech, language and communication. and it is right that speech, language and communication should be both a core requirement and an elective module of the new Masters in Teaching and Learning, upon the introduction of which I congratulate the Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families. Joint working must be to the fore, and I'm sorry to say that at the moment that principle is honoured more often in the breach than in the observance, especially at the level of strategic planning and priority setting. That's why I've said let each Children's Trust designate an appointed person who will drive forward the pursuit of improved speech, language and communication outcomes. I say that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, possibly as the voice of cynical experience, because I have a sense that if something is everybody's responsibility, ultimately it is no one's responsibility. Yeah. Name an individual, give him or her a task, set the benchmark, require the assessment, demand the performance, and at least there is a likelihood that you will provide a catalyst for improvement, and certainly the public have someone to whom very properly to direct their complaints or representations if success isn't achieved. And tackling the postcode is, of course, critical, absolutely critical. Local variation, local initiation, local social entrepreneurship, local variety depending upon the makeup of one area relative to another, of course, is valid and necessary. But we've got to make some sort of core offer to children and young people that they can depend upon a certain type and level of service, irrespective of the part of the country in which they happen to live. And in that regard, I risk upsetting my honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, on the opposition front bench, perhaps, but I do say I think there is a compelling case for the continuation of early years targets beyond 2011 and work towards the development of a national indicator on speech, language and communication as the prelude to a public service agreement target post-2011. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have to say that engagement in this review has been the single most stimulating and rewarding endeavour of my 11-year parliamentary life. It is about two things. It's about helping needy, marginalised, vulnerable, sometimes frightened young people, because that is the right and decent thing to do. And I have a child who is so affected, and I make no apology for trying to do my best to ensure that other children get the sort of excellent help that my son Oliver is receiving. But it isn't just or mainly about compassion or niceness or being decent. It is about the authentic self-interest of Britain plc, because tackling these problems is relevant to the educational attainment agenda, relevant to the greater qualifications agenda, relevant to the acquisition of vocational skills agenda, relevant to the fight against antisocial behaviour agenda, relevant to the improvement of public health agenda, and relevant to the pursuit of the commercial advantage of UK plc in an age in which a job for life is a relic of the past and the premium placed on speech, language and communication in today's knowledge economy is greater than ever. If in my small way, with the assistance of a fantastic advisory group and the support and engagement of parliamentarians on all sides of the House, I can broker an improvement in services to and the life chances of these vulnerable children and young people, I tell you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that I shall die a happier man, though I hope not just yet.
Hilary Armstrong.